Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by my good friend, Chris Adlam, for an exciting episode, which will be Ontario focused. But I think we're going to make the argument, as we have on some previous episodes, notably with Gary Rose, the Ontario Nuclear Advantage, that this is a jurisdiction that folks should be paying attention to. There's some really exciting things happening here in Ontario. We are looking at solid demand projections. And I think fundamentally I've come to see, thanks to Edgardo Sepulveda actually, that the number one reason that we haven't built nuclear in the West in the last 20 and 30 years is that there hasn't been the demand. Why are you going to put a lot of money into capital intensive projects if you're not sure there'll be customers for the kilowatt hours at the back end to make it all pay for itself? So we're seeing a real reversal of that in Ontario, pretty solid demand projections that are just increasing year by year, 60 terawatt hours, I believe, by the mid 2030s. So we're talking about space for 10 new large Candu reactors. And I think today we are going to be echoing the recent Canadians for Nuclear Energy Case for Candu report, making the case that 50 or 60 terawatt hours worth of demand should be met primarily by Candu. So before we go any further, Chris Adlam, you've been on the We Can Do It podcast, but I believe this is your inaugural Decouple episode. So a warm welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, I mean, in addition to being, a real co-founder of C4NE, you were the first Canadian that I kind of met in real life as this whole crazy idea came together to form a nonprofit focusing on advocacy for nuclear in Canada. You're kind of the spiritual godfather of the Canadian movement here, and you've really been very influential both in sort of keeping the faith on the Pickering refurbishment, which at times looked utterly hopeless. And you've really, I think, been a guiding sort of, I don't want to use too hyperbolic language here, but it's just what comes to me, kind of a visionary when it comes to this case for Candu that we're going to be talking about today. So maybe just a little bit of background. We'll keep it pretty short and sweet, but just how you came to be passionate about what you are passionate about.
Well, amusingly, it came as a result of the rate increases that we experienced under the Green Energy Act. And that whole being blamed on nuclear, despite there being no nuclear construction projects happening at the time, the refurbishments hadn't started, resulted in me kind of deep diving into the Ontario grid and what made it up and what were the contributing factors. And that launched my interests in nuclear. So yeah, it's been over 10 years for sure. My family has an engineering background. My grandfather and his father both worked for GE and hydroelectric. So, do sort of come by my interest naturally. But it was the GEA that essentially launched this whole interest.
Yeah. And just for international listeners, the Green Energy Act was our sort of feed-in tariff program to encourage a massive build out of renewables here in Ontario. Apparently it was to create 50,000 jobs here in Ontario. We're really trying to do supply chain localization for our wind and solar. And it's been a pretty massive flop in terms of the promises of green jobs. It's also cost
it was a
net loss because of deindustrialization as a result
because
of
we had the manufacturing exodus. And the funny part was it was framed as having no impact on rates. And so then they went and signed contracts for 80 cents a kilowatt hour for solar, 15 plus cents a kilowatt hour for wind. And the going rate prior to that was 4 cents retail. And supposedly this was going to have no impact on rates. And then, of course, rates escalated. And then people, you saw in the media, they're blaming the nuclear plants. And it was like, well, how is that possible? Because retail rates were 4 cents and the nuclear plants haven't changed. So,
well, we will have probably a whole other episode on the Green Energy Act. And it is a fascinating story because, just kind of euphemistically or simplistically, I often frame Ontario as the France of North America. We're 60% nuclear. But we attempted to be the Germany of North America with this very massive investment, which over the lifetime of those contracts will cost us something like $60 billion. We currently subsidize those subsidies on the tax base, I think at the cost of about 3.1 billion per year, which is like item line number 9 or 10 on the whole Ontario budget. That comes after healthcare, which is number 1, and I think long-term care, which is number 5 or 6. Really, really quite a scandalous history, and I think something that we should deep dive in the future. But back to the matter at hand, we're going to talk Candu. Again, I made the case with Gary Rose that Ontario is the best equipped jurisdiction in the Western world to build new nuclear. And that is primarily because of our Candu refurbishments. We talked about what that's done to our supply chain, our skilled workforce, the kind of institutional excellence that we've seen. But Chris, maybe just give us a quick background on those refurbishments, because I think they're so important to what makes Ontario such an attractive spot for new nuclear in the West.
Well, I think we have to historically look at the Pickering 1 and 4 refurbishments. They often get referred to as, and I've been corrected by Tom Hess never to call them that, they were essentially reactivations. They went over budget. Well, sorry, that's incorrect. Unit 4 went over budget. Unit 1 was on budget, but was still claimed to go over budget by people that were using the initial estimate rather than the revised estimate after Unit 4 was completed. But then Bruce Power undertook the units 1 and 2 refurbishment. Those were the first large-scale refurbishments we'd had ever done. And they were actually surprisingly close to budget. If you look at the overall project cost, but the budget for that kind of changed a little bit at the beginning once they modified the scope a bit. They had to do full boiler replacement, but they had also ordered the boilers for units 3 and 4, which were just kept on site. But those projects were really, really long. We'd never done it before. Bruce Power had never done it before. So it was a huge learning exercise for them. So then while that was happening, we also had the refurbishment of Pickering B queued up and the refurbishment of Pickering 2 and 3. McGinty canceled the refurbishment of Pickering 2 and 3, also canceled the refurbishment of Pickering B. But Kathleen Wynne, I believe at the time, did approve the refurbishment of Darlington A, which started in 2016, which was long after the GEA stuff we touched on earlier. Anyways, it's been on time, on budget. There was a ton of learning that came out of the Bruce 1 and 2 refurbishments, and that helped both OPG and Bruce Power, which is why both of them are ahead of schedule and on budget right now with their refurbishment projects. And that gives them some social license, right? If they can execute these massive undertakings on time, on budget, then they could also do the same with new builds. So the success of these refurbishments really creates an environment where we could execute large-scale new builds with very low risk, which nowhere else in the world, other than perhaps China, has that opportunity. You look at the Vogel project in Georgia, 15 years, they're still having problems with Unit 3. Resurrecting that industry and that supply chain it's been a bit of a disaster. We haven't had that problem. We had our learning experience with the Bruce A units, and everything else has been perfect.
And just to backtrack a second, and not in too much detail, but just this maybe will help us differentiate the technologies a little bit. The PWR, the BWR, pressurized and boiling water reactors. I want to understand what exactly refurbishment is. We'll keep it really brief, but this is just for context, Canada's largest infrastructure project, the refurbishment of I believe between Bruce and Darlington, what's that? It'll be 12 units. Pickering, of course, will be added onto the list. But for just the Bruce and Darlington units, we're talking $26 billion. And I think a lot of people, when they hear that number, they think, okay, this is an investment just in the assets. And of course, it's an investment in the assets. But I think what gets missed there is this is a massive investment in the supply chain. This is a huge investment in human resources and in building the kind of institutional excellence that can deliver projects, not just on schedule, but I think Unit 3 at Darlington is 6 months ahead of schedule. That's pretty unprecedented, not just in nuclear, but I should say not just in modern nuclear, but also in mega projects in general. And each of these is a nuclear mega project with all of the challenges of, absolute precise, workmanship, et cetera. I think they've been about 3 to 4 billion a piece, so not small budgets. Although those budgets are coming down as you mentioned with this kind of learning by doing. But just briefly, how is a Candu refurbishment different than the kind of maintenance we see at a standard American style, shall we say, pressurized or boiling water reactor?
Well, boiling water reactors don't have steam generators, so the pressure vessel is the steam generator. Actually, interestingly enough, the RBMK, Chernobyl, also didn't have steam generators. It was kind of a hybridization. But PWRs do have steam generators, just like Candus. But a Candu has sort of a unique feature with respect to the pressure tubes, right? We don't have a pressure vessel. We have these tubes that perforate the calandria, and they are our wear item.
Just for people to visualize this, the way that I've sort of simplified it is like a PWR, maybe a BWR, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, is kind of like a pressure cooker. You have this, big forged vessel that can handle, large pressures. And it sounds pretty kind of simple. And then when I think about a Candu, I've just been looking at like a lot of cutaways of locomotive engines, steam engines with my son, and you have this chamber, and then within it you have all kinds of tubes coming from the firebox that are, moving heat through. I'm not sure if that's like a good analogy, but I'm just trying to create a very simplistic visual image for people of what a calandria, what a Candu core looks like compared to a PWR, BWR core.
The BWR, the steam doesn't stay in the core, right? It goes out and runs the turbine. But with the PWR, yeah, it's basically a pressure cooker, and then that water's used to heat a secondary circuit, which in turn runs the turbine, which is the same way the Candu operates. But yeah, we have this giant vat of water that has these perforations through it, the pressure tubes, well, calandria tubes, and then inside the calandria tubes are the pressure tubes. But that's what boils the water, and the water, heavy water, circulates through those pressure tubes, which then, like with the PWR, heats secondary circuit, which runs the turbine. And these are a replaceable component, and they're a wear item. 30 to 40 years is usually the range. Darlington was done early. They started at 30 years because I think OPG just saw the opportunity to get that project underway so that it couldn't get canceled. There was some tribulation at the government level at the time. OPG had already had 2 projects canceled on them. Well, actually, no. They've had 3 projects canceled them at that time. They had Pickering 2 and 3, Pickering B, and then Darlington B. Had all been canceled on OPG. So I think they just really wanted to get that project underway so that they could be working on something, and then less opportunity for the government to cancel it or pull it out from underneath them. So Darlington seemed to have started early. The Bruce units are in their 40s when they're starting theirs. So there's your 30 to 40 year range. The Pickering units are also in their 40s. They'll be late 40s by the time they start refurbishment, maybe even pushing 50. So there's this range, and it's all dependent on, of course, the hydrogen equivalent concentration of the pressure tubes, which is a variable that we track and model. But yeah, that sets the Candu apart from the other 2 designs, that it has this replaceable component. So with the BWR or PWR, both light water reactors, with the BWR specifically, you don't have the steam generators to deal with. But with the PWR, you have steam generator replacement at some point during the plant's life. You have turbine upgrades, control system upgrades. These are all things that you would also do at a Candu. But you don't have that single midlife event that you have to plan around. So these things are kind of staggered over the plant's life. Whereas with the Candu, because we have this large project of pressure tube replacement, and we've done pressure tube replacement without doing refurbishment, and that's important to note. refurbishments are seen as, whoa, you have this massive, very expensive undertaking in the middle of the plant's life. Well, yeah, we do, but it's not necessarily to do all of those things. It's just convenient to do all of those things at that time because the unit's going to be offline for a period of time. Like Pickering A units were all retubed, but they were retubed without refurbishment. And the cost was considerably less. It was like in the millions of dollars versus the billions of dollars. So that's a it's a differentiator there that kind of needs to be acknowledged when you're talking about the price of this project, because all of these other things that we're talking about, the control system upgrades, the steam generator replacements, turbine upgrades, all of those things have cost, and they have cost regardless of the type of plant. So we just kind of roll all that together with the Candu and do it all as one project. The stator was being replaced, I believe, at Darlington Unit 3, for example. But Darlington's not getting new steam generators because they're a new enough design that they didn't need to be replaced. Bruce, all of the units are getting the steam generators replaced. So there's 2 refurbishments with 2 different approaches. And Bruce, we're seeing massive uprates on all of the units. Like the A unit's 750 megawatts originally. They're currently churning out, 825, 830. And then that'll be more still once they're allowed to run at 100% full power. So overall, I was going to say, in terms of cost, I don't really know there's that much of a difference. It's just with LWRs, you're seeing that kind of drawn out over a longer period. You're not seeing this single project at the 30, 40 year mark.
And with that replaceable core, presumably if the civil engineering holds up, the concrete holds up, we may be able to do more than one refurbishment. I mean, PWRs,
Correct.
We're talking about lifespans now, licensing being extended to 80 years. That's pretty impressive. The reactor pressure vessel is the kind of limiting factor, it sounds like, but
yeah, and that's a big variable.
Incredible. Yeah, incredible. But potentially Candus could be refurbished multiple times and like be century plus infrastructure like hydro dams.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
And that was studied by the Koreans, if I remember correctly. They already looked at what it would look like to do a second full refurbishment. And depending on the rest of the plant, right? Like depending on the condition of the turbine, depending on the condition of the generator unit, depending on the condition of the control systems and how that looks relative to what's available at the time, you might not do all of those things on the second refurbishment.
Okay, so moving on from this kind of deep dive discussion, let's talk a little bit more about, I guess, the case for Candu. Just briefly again, because I think we have covered this in previous episodes with Jeremy Whitlock and a little bit with Gary. In terms of the Candu's development, those advantages and kind of being tailored to Canada, just briefly, what are those? How did it come about, and why? What are some of the technological changes? For instance, the pressure tubes. Why did we do that rather than pursuing these more traditional, or just, I shouldn't say more traditional, but these other approaches of a big reactor pressure vessel?
Well, the Western world was going nuclear. Fission was being pursued by all of the nations post World War II. Canada was in a position where we had no heavy forging capacity. We have no enrichment capacity because we didn't have a nuclear weapons program. So rather than becoming beholden to the United States for enrichment, for fuel and forgings, we decided to pursue, doing that without a dependence on the United States. What could we do domestically? And that resulted in NPD and our whole pursuit of this pressure tube design, which we could produce domestically. And the use of deuterium, heavy water, allowed us to do it without enrichment. And we have the richest uranium deposits in the world. And so we're in a unique position to exploit that and have incredibly low life cycle emissions because we have so much pure uranium versus other locations. We don't have to worry about enriching it. And we have a design that is wholly domestic. So in terms of energy security, it presented a fantastic case for us to just do our own thing, basically.
Right, and that's becoming even more relevant now as we attempt to boycott enrichment, and Russia controls about 46% of world's enrichment capacity. China, I believe, another 10%, and I think the dwarves are for the dwarves there. The Chinese have a huge fleet and a rapidly growing fleet and some geopolitical nuclear allies looking to become an export nation. I don't think they're going to share a lot of that enrichment capacity with the West. And then a bunch of the West's enrichment capacity is in Europe, where energy prices are absolutely through the roof. And as my friend Caleb Calumetz was pointing out, if the West is to pursue a major investment in new enrichment capacity, the investors kind of need to be certain that the Russian uranium won't come off sanction in the midst of that investment cycle and essentially, bankrupt those companies that take that risk. So, that natural enrichment case is kind of accidentally much stronger in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is
absolutely
another part of the case for Candu. But let's talk about a few things, because I think the Candu reactor is being criticized for some of those advantages no longer being advantageous. You didn't mention, and no fault to you here, but the online refueling component of Candu, which maybe just briefly go into that quality of the reactor before we kind of move on to sort of break down some of these advantages and whether they are still advantages.
Well, you're using natural uranium, right? So you have less fissile content per fuel element. So you're going to have to be swapping that fuel out. And you don't want to be taking the reactor down to be doing that. So we developed online refueling as part of the Candu development, so that the units could stay online and have the fuel shuffled. And there's 2 fueling machines, one on either end of the calandria, that shuffles the fuel in and out. We did used to do, and I learned this at Bruce, that we no longer do it. We used to do a core reorder, where you'd take stuff from the center, move it to the outside, stuff from the outside, move it to the inside. But you wouldn't be necessarily putting in new bundles. You'd be trying to optimize the core. Now we do that through just straight up refueling. The stuff that's in the center gets swapped out faster than the stuff that's on the periphery. Less wear and tear on the fueling machines. So there was, if the fuel was more expensive, which it's not, we have the cheapest fuel on the planet. There might have been some sense made of doing the reorder, but in the current context, there isn't.
And I guess the original promise was that this would give us absolutely outstanding capacity factors because we wouldn't have to have outages.
Correct.
For refueling. Obviously, certain countries are struggling with their pressurized water fleets to have short outages, and France would be, I guess, the showcase there. But
I wouldn't call that struggling.
Okay.
And you're touched on a very important subject here. So yes, very early on, Candu's had incredible capacity factors compared to other designs because they didn't have to shut down to be refueled. You look at Darlington, 1,106 days of uninterrupted generation. We've always held the records for longest runtime. Briefly, the UK, one of their AGRs, was able to take that title. Then we took it back with Darlington. So, and that's not only nuclear; that's thermal plants. Period. That record with Darlington, but the U.S., the market-based system. They don't have any single state that has the same level of capacity that Ontario has. So they don't have a problem or they have too much nuclear. France is in the same boat as Ontario. The spring and fall, you have too much capacity. So there's no incentive to optimize these outages because bringing capacity back too early, you can't bring it on.
Right.
You're going to be shutting it off anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's nowhere to put them. So that's been a bit of a luxury for both Ontario and France that we haven't had to rush our maintenance outages. And in fact, it's been beneficial to just extend them and, kind of drag our heels. And we see that still with France. We still see that still with Ontario. Now, OPG has been putting in efforts to improve on their efficiency because they are comparing themselves to the US LWR fleet. And the US LWR fleet is the benchmark in terms of low levels of outages and high capacity factors. But as I said, they don't have the problem that France and Ontario have with excess capacity. So it's not really fair to contrast either Ontario or France to the US because, you look at that, people draw conclusions about it being a design issue. It's not a design issue. Many of the Candus outside of Ontario have much higher capacity factors than we do in Ontario. It's a situational issue, not a design issue. That gets viewed as a design issue or spun as a design issue when it fundamentally isn't.
This whole conversation, I think, is leaping out of a tweet that I made quoting our Natural Resources Minister, Seamus O'Regan, and he basically said, Candu is, I'm not sure if he said the or a gold standard reactor around the world. I guess it must have been the, because there's only one gold standard. And I retweeted that because I feel like Candu has been significantly undermarketed and underappreciated, particularly in the most recent context. We're not really building anything, and we're really hyping so-called advanced nuclear. And frankly, where ACL and S&C have, again, been a bit of a mess and not really too focused, particularly when it comes to actually promoting and bidding on new nuclear builds around the world. So that was the motivation for me posting it, and it generated a kind of firestorm on Twitter, and some really intelligent responses, and a really lively debate about whether Candu should be called that. Of course, it was music to my ears hearing Fred DeMarcar at the Canadian Nuclear Society actually quoting the PRIS data, looking at capacity factors between 2011 and 2021, and indeed a Candu unit was the top performer in the world, Cernavoda Unit 2, I believe. And then he was pointing out that in jurisdictions that run Candus and other reactor technologies, the top performing reactors in Korea and China over that time period were also Candu. So that was a nice little arrow in the quiver. But I don't think that the goal of either of us is to say that the Candu is the only reactor that we should be building in the future. Far from it. It's just that it makes a lot of sense in Ontario, and as we were saying with the uranium enrichment issues, makes a lot of sense for countries that are very concerned about their energy security, and also maybe wanting to prioritize local manufacturing, as we did at the beginning. Just one other point about the online refueling. Another benefit that I've heard, in addition to some of these extraordinary long run times, is there's an ability to decide on when exactly you're going to do an outage. And if there's a forecast that, hey, the next month is going to be a bit of a squeeze, there's not sort of a fixed date when you have to come offline, or where your fuel's aging and your power output's going down. You can continue to run that baby at sort of full output, which gives, I think, a little bit of flexibility in terms of grid planning overall.
Yeah, absolutely. We have full control over when we have the outages. To a point. There are hours-based parameters. That's actually what killed the Darlington runtime. 1,106 days. It could have kept going, but they had to do an inspection that was based on the number of hours the unit had been online, and unfortunately, that specific inspection required the unit to be offline to do it. Post refurbishment, that is no longer the case. One of the optimizations and tweaks that have been made as part of these refurbishments has been to minimize the events that require the unit to come offline. So maintenance and inspections, a lot of this stuff can now be done with the unit operational. So I think we should be looking to OPG to exceed that record in the future, now that no longer weighs in there. So that's an interesting Candu advantage. Another thing I never mentioned in that Twitter exchange was, of course, the production of medical isotopes. And that's also a unique Candu feature.
There's so much to talk about, Chris.
60, Moly 99, lutetium 177,
so much to talk about. And when I was planning this podcast, I'm like, this has the potential to go completely off the rails and be super annoying, because I think we both have so much to say, but I think we're doing a good job so far. I do want to tug on a thread there, plant the seed. We'll hit it later, but basically, what you're touching on with the potential now with some tweaks and the operational experience to minimize outages even further or optimize the design. And often that's very mundane stuff. I was hearing someone saying, part of our modernization program is simply to, for equipment that requires frequent maintenance, to make sure it's accessible without, having to erect a 2-story scaffold, because sometimes you're short on carpenters and that can actually delay things slightly. Like the what was I going to say? It's mundane. Some of the things that we think of, like when we think about improving a reactor design, often we're thinking about like novel, cooling fluids, et cetera. And sometimes it's, some of this very, very basic stuff, and it's not sexy, so it doesn't get talked about. But I want to plant that seed, talk about it later. But just finishing up there, we kind of deep dived online refueling. Using natural uranium was a huge advantage early on for energy security reasons, and also because gas diffusion enrichment, I understand, was very energy intensive, very expensive. Those costs came down. But of course, we have this novel challenge now of most enrichment capacity being outside of the West and in Russia and China combined. Heavy water is obviously kind of the expense when it comes, if you want to think of it that way, to the kind of fueling of a Candu, or its optimal physics. How does that compare in terms of the cost towards enrichment, and what are the challenges, I guess, that we have moving forward with heavy water?
Well, we did have 3 massive heavy water plants at Bruce that all got raised when the export market vanished after the financial collapse, which is unfortunate because that would have driven down the cost of heavy water significantly. It was powered using process steam at Bruce. So it was, basically excess heat was used to create heavy water, which would have been extremely economic. Of course, the process used has a toxic element to it, which resulted in part of the Inver Huron Park not being usable when the heavy water plants were.
And not because it was discharging the toxin, but if something went wrong, it could have gone really badly wrong, correct?
It was just a risk associated with I think a Girdler sulfide, I believe is the process that was in use. You have these massive distillation towers you're utilizing to essentially distill out and further increase the purity of the heavy water. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of them, but they were massive.
No, but I do remember the story of this, provincial park, and there's these kind of evacuation notices. Like if you hear the air siren, get out fast. And people would probably assume it's because, maybe there's a risk that the nuclear plant's going to melt down. And it had
nothing to do with
heavy
the
water
plant,
which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's because of the chemicals, right? Using the Girdler sulfide process, you have a risk with those chemicals, and there was basically a exclusion zone around the heavy water plants.
So suffice it.
But the Bruce site's massive, right?
Suffice it to say, heavy water is an expense, and it is going to be a challenge to a Candu Renaissance because we got to make a bunch more of it.
Well, we will if we have to build a lot of units. We do have some excess heavy water right now, but yeah, if we undertake a construction of 4 new units, we don't have enough.
And in our report, we're advocating for another 10. So starting with
exactly.
10.
And now it's not a recurring expense, right? Like you can operate existing heavy water stores, which is what we do at Darlington, Pickering, and Bruce. So it's not a consumable. It's something you just hold on to, but it is part of the initial capex. But how considerable that is, I think you have to look at that in context. Like Vogtle was $35 billion for 2,200 megawatts or 2,400 megawatts, whatever it was, and took 15 years. And the most recent Candu builds for Qinshan in China, 2 EC6s, 1,400 megawatts, $3.8 billion, 4 years. They had no startup issues. Like the plants just came online and worked. Like we're wholly unremarkable. There's no news about those 2 units in Qinshan because nothing happened. Like when they built the EPRs in China, they had fuel leaks, and that was all over the news.
Or Oikoloto with their massive.
And that was another thing about
seals,
the unlined refueling.
They've got these massive pumps because their core is like 1,600 megawatts. Yeah.
And these are first of a kind designs, right? And they have growing and teething pains, whereas the EC6 is just a tweaked C6. It's a design that we've built for 50 years, yet it's Gen 3 plus. So that's another thing is that all of these new PWR or BWR designs, yes, they're evolutionary, but they have some significant safety system upgrades for passive controls to make them Gen 3 plus compliant that have been part of the Candu design since the beginning. So we haven't had to make those upgrades because the design's already compliant. So, you make some small tweaks to make certain things automated, but at the end of the day, that safety system was already in place. So it was much easier to turn the C6 into the EC6 and make it Gen 3 plus than it has been for any other design. So we would see the same thing if we resurrect the C9.
And you know, I think some people would argue that the Qinshan units, well, they're built in China, and China has a ramped up, you know, supply chain workforce. They're hyper efficient with, you know, mega projects of all different kinds, high speed rail, building hospitals quickly. I guess one of them collapsed during the COVID response, but even the AP1000s didn't go super smoothly in China. I understand the build time was about 8 years per unit,
and neither did the EPRs.
So
no, and the EC6 is a cookie cutter design. And as I said, the execution 4 years, like ridiculously fast. And 3 years on Priss because they go from actual first concrete, but it's from actual shovel to breaker. So like site to producing power was 4 years. It's ridiculous.
So that's interesting to me because in terms of the lifetime cost of a nuclear plant, if you have construction issues, obviously, you've got massive loans that are generating interest, particularly if you're not state backed or sort of bond backed, like Hinkley Point, for instance, where I think half the final cost is going to be, or maybe even 2/3 is just going to be interest payments over the lifetime of a plant. How much does that upfront construction cost impact? Because I mean, I remember Mark Nelson talking about, hey, even Diablo Canyon sort of almost cost what Vogtle cost, but now it's producing ultra cheap power. Like, how much of an advantage is it if you can build on time and on budget in terms of the kind of amortized costs?
It's significant. I mean, Darlington was our white elephant, right? Because it was delayed by Chernobyl and the financial collapse. Do we finish the plant? Well, interest rates were insane at the time, and so a large portion of Darlington's cost, far more than in any of the other projects, is interest or was interest. But depreciated, Darlington produces power for 3.7 cents. So it's ridiculously cheap. Like the OPEX for the plant is ridiculously cheap. So as long as you can pay off, you can amortize that CAPEX, which Ontario Hydro was doing with all of the plants at the time. You know, Hydro-Quebec has something like 58 billion in debt
on their hydro assets
from their construction projects. And it's not an issue because the assets are worth more than the debt. So Ontario Hydro is very much in the same boat, which is, you know, you can do that with public utilities. They can carry large debt. They have cheap borrowing costs. You don't have that advantage with these private projects. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons there were no real plants built in other jurisdictions, especially in the United States, that rivaled the size of what Ontario Hydro built. You know, Ontario Hydro built 8 units, one plant, and then did another 8, and then another 8. But they didn't finish the second part of the 8, right? Because Darlington was supposed to be an 8-unit plant, which we've seen the pictures of. So, you know, that level of ambition and the commitment to stuff of that scale, you didn't have elsewhere other than France. France did the same thing. Gravelines is a huge plant. Japan. Because... Yep, Japan. Yeah, another example. Ukraine.
Zaporizhia.
6 units that are currently. The private projects versus the public projects. The private projects, these companies are more risk adverse. They can't do the scale that we see with these public build-outs. Like who is going to build the James Bay project? Right? You look at the Hoover Dam. Well, it's huge. It's nothing.
That's a hydro project, Northern Quebec. We'll talk a little bit, make some comparisons with the Ontario Candu fleet, maybe right now. But yes, just to fill international listeners in, we're talking about. Is it something like the big dam in China? I'm blanking on the name right now in terms of output, or not quite.
No, that dam is the largest hydro dam in the world. James Bay project is multiple dams,
but total output,
totaling about. It's 25 gigawatts or 24 gigawatts, something like that. It's quite large, but that's spanning 4 or 6 dams, if I remember correctly, all on the same water system, right? All in the James Bay watershed, and it flooded an area the size of the state of Florida,
or Belgium, if you want a European comparison.
That
17,000 square kilometers. I just posted a video of Dylan at Yosemite. Talking about Ansel Adams, the iconic Sierra Club, one of the founding members, or at least very prominent, also one of the the photographers of Yosemite, and he was just mentioning that comparing the Ontario nuclear build out, which including the mines and the fuel fabrication and the sites, is on a footprint of 20 square kilometers. The James Bay project, which actually has a lower output, 17,000 square kilometers. So this is not to bash on hydro, which is a very important power source and has some great qualities to it, but just to point out some of the trade-offs between different technology sources.
Oh, absolutely. And one thing you mentioned earlier was about the cost of the refurbishments. And, that capital cost, the $26 billion or whatever it's going to be to do Bruce and Darlington. Bruce can produce 55 terawatt hours a year. Its lifetime output so far is almost 1,600 terawatt hours. Darlington's pushing 800 terawatt hours now. Pickering is on the cusp of a petawatt hour at the moment. So, and that you look at that, okay, well, that's an investment to do that again, to continue that for another 40, 50 years, whatever. We're looking at $24 billion. Well, the Green Energy Act cost us $60 billion. So it costs more than the entire Ontario nuclear fleet. And it will produce roughly 300 terawatt hours for the entire lifetime of all of that equipment. So in terms of, value for money, they're not even remotely comparable, right? You make that $24 billion investment, but then you look at how much that equipment has already produced in terms of and you more than double it, because Bruce is going to be more productive. Pickering is going to be more productive. Darlington is going to be more productive.
We will deep dive the Green Energy Act. That is a strong commitment based off of this conversation. I want to loop back to the safety and the Gen 3 Plus stuff. I've been told not to use this. It's a bit of a low blow, perhaps. We really shouldn't be making any safety arguments and denigrating other technologies. And I think that's a real lesson for the advanced nuclear people, and that use of the term advanced nuclear, which I do intend to do a small diatribe on in this conversation. But it is a fact that there's been 5 widely deployed reactor technologies. We've already talked about PWR, boiling water reactors, pressurized water reactors, the pressurized heavy water reactor, the Candu. Then we have the RBMK, and I guess the gas graphite reactor. These were widely deployed. There's only 3 that kind of are AGRs.
The AGRs.
Yeah. There's only 3 that are continue to be viable and widely deployed, as the RBMK has kind of went out of fashion with Chernobyl, and the AGRs, unfortunately, their cores are exactly right. So
yeah.
The interesting fact that was pointed out to me that there's only one of these reactor technologies that has never experienced a core melt. So why don't we talk a little bit about that, and again, why the Candu is so inherently safe?
Well, the Candu is kind of a bit like an onion. You have all of these layers, and they all have water, and it's real hard to melt stuff when everything is sitting in multiple vats of water. Candu can be passively cooled, which is a new feature for everybody else, not a new feature for the Candu. The calandria is surrounded with light water shielding. So you have the calandria that itself is full of heavy water. It's surrounded by light water. The pressure tubes have water in them. And then you have a massive water makeup tank, which is also a new feature for other designs, which we always had. Massive water makeup tank in the top of the individual units, or if you're talking about our 4-packs, which are unique to Ontario, the entire top of the vacuum building, which is another safety system that other plants don't have, which is why, I'm going off a little bit of a tangent here, but if you ever look at how close Pickering is to housing and businesses, nobody has a plant that's that close, but we have a plant that's that close. And it's part of the reason we have this vacuum building that facilitated that. It's, you already have your redundant safety systems, but then you also have this secondary containment structure, which if you did have an event, and we've never had to use them, but if you did have an event, it would suck the contents.
So any of the volatiles.
And then douse it. But that water can also be used as a makeup source for any of the units that are connected to it. And it is an obscene amount of water. So, say you had a fuel channel break, which we have had. We had a fuel channel break at Pickering, and it was a total non-event. It dumped a whole pile of water. It had to get cleaned up. They shut off the unit. They didn't even have to use the safety shutdown system, the emergency shutdown system. They just shut the unit down normally. And that was the largest safety event that we ever had. A 2-meter
So
long
we
split
had
in a
some
pressure tube.
rather hysterical reporting from an anti-nuclear reporter, Marco Ovid. I will name his name, and he talked about the potential, or maybe he quoted an expert, potential for like a domino effect and like cascading pressure tubes, collapsing, and that this kind of provided a mechanism for, I guess, kind of a core melt scenario. Is that probable, possible?
It's never happened. So we did have a situation where he had massive level of hydrogen uptake in a localized area, which is what resulted in the 2-meter split in the pressure tube. There were adjacent pressure tubes that were affected with the same problem, right? What the heck are they called? The annulus spacers. So the pressure tube sits inside the calandria tube, and there's these little rings that essentially go around that keep the pressure tube off the calandria tube. They move. And in this case, they moved, and there was some sag, and they touched, and that created a spot that developed a massive amount of hydrogen embrittlement. And it's from that spot that the crack propagated. That happened in adjacent tubes as well. Only the one tube split. As I said, the unit was shut down conventionally. Now we monitor for that. There's an ultrasonic probe that goes into the pressure tubes. We know where all of the annulus spacers are, and we've never had that level of hydrogen uptake again. Greatly exceeded the design level. With the limits for hydrogen concentration are extraordinarily conservative, which is part of the reason shutting off Pickering prematurely is ridiculous, because its hydrogen uptake levels are
okay. So we do have a whole episode on pressure tubes, so I want to steer a little clear of that. No, but if you're interested, we will post that in the show notes. Just a last point, because you mentioned all these safety features, and I think this is really, really important, because we've talked about how a lot of the novel designs have a lot of first-of-a-kind features, a lot of wrinkles to work out. It's made them very difficult to construct. And I think about designs that are pushing that potentially even further, chasing these safety increments, which are basically irrelevant. I mean, these traditional Gen 2 PWRs and BWRs are very, very safe machines, particularly even in an accident. The health consequences are essentially zilch with proper containment. Absolutely. Unlike the Chernobyl reactors. But leaving that diatribe aside, the idea of NuScale, having a sort of traditional PWR, I guess the steam generators are kind of put within the RPV, if I'm understanding correctly, but the idea of needing to build the world's largest and robust swimming pool to dunk these reactor pressure vessels in. I mean, this is to chase these safety margins, but it radically increases cost, material usage, and potentially makes these functionally unbuildable. Obviously, the AP1000, not functionally unbuildable, but a massive challenge. The EPR, similar story. And I think that's a real concern I have for a lot of these other first-of-a-kind designs, and where that Candu advantage shines through in terms of constructability is all of these little lessons learned along the way of operation without significant design changes being necessary, because we have so much inherent safety built in. So just one other thing I've heard about is, you mentioned it, the passive cooling feature. Just explain briefly how that works, and then we're going to move on.
So the Candu can be cooled via convection. That's a new feature with other designs. That's an inherent feature with the Candu. You flood the steam generators. With the unit shut off, it just naturally convects through the steam generators and dissipates the heat. And if you need some makeup water, it gets pulled from that massive tank I mentioned earlier.
And that's like 10 to 12 days, I understand, of passive.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, it's almost 2 weeks. Wow. Worth of passive capacity there. So if you can't get a pump on in 2 weeks, because you can't have a tsunami on the Great Lakes. So, but yeah, if you can't get a pump on in 2 weeks, you've got other problems. But yeah, I mean, conceivably you could use a bucket line to fill the makeup tank if you wanted to, right? Like, right. You have so much margin there.
Yeah. Okay. I'm at a loss for words here. Let's move on a little bit. I think we've kind of really touched on the rationale, and potentially it's a little facetious, of calling Candu the gold standard reactor, admitting that there's really no gold standard. No. There's reactors that have slightly different use cases. And I guess if you'll permit me, I really want to workshop this bit of messaging I've been working on, which is this idea of there being no such thing as advanced nuclear. To me, it's kind of similar to talking about or using a framework of, well, advanced fossil fuels. For me, it's just that there's different use cases. So it's like saying a non-gasoline engine is advanced. Like a diesel engine can do things that are different. It's better suited for, run times that are basically going constant, for farm machinery, for mining equipment, for certain types of propulsion for ships. That doesn't make it advanced. It's just a different use case. Or, a jet turbine. Well, that can fly an airplane or generate power in a way that a gasoline engine can't. Does that make it advanced or just a different use case? And, when I think about trying to generate high process heat with nuclear, that is vitally important if we're serious about decarbonization. Does that make it advanced? And
no, because we've done it before.
Right. And I mean, a lot of these designs are coming out of the 1950s experiments, but
yep, they're all coming out of the 1950s experiments. You're 100% correct on that.
It's similar to using, like, language is vitally important, particularly when communicating to the lay public. Just this ridiculous basket of renewables to incorporate things, as environmentally harmful as biomass, and trying to lump that in with things like wind and solar, hydro, being dispatchable and of great utility, creating kind of low entropy, useful power. It's not a useful term. It also appeals to the natural, the appeal to nature fallacy. But I think advanced nuclear is kind of similarly problematic. Things like, NuScale or BWRX often are classified in this advanced basket.
And there's nothing advanced about the BWRX. It's a BWR.
And that's not to denigrate it. That's amazing. It's amazing they're using an iterative
just a regular design. It's a small version of a conventional design. But you brought up
let me just finish the diatribe, if you will.
Very important.
Let me finish the diatribe, if you will. Obviously, using a term like advanced denigrates the existing fleet. Instills in the public this idea that what we have right now is no good. It's going to go the way of the dodo. It's not safe enough. It's creating too much waste. This just plays into the anti-nuclear communications book. So I would like to forward that as an idea. I'm very open to people pushing back on that, but I think this is a marketing term, which was a massive mistake, and we need to really move away from it. Dylan Moon, author, the guy putting the words on the page and doing a lot of analysis and research, said that Candu is the only advanced reactor that has 25 units deployed around the world. I thought that was kind of funny. But I think we need to have a certain amount of humor, and we need to entertain debate about the language that we use. I cut you off, Adlam. Go ahead. Riff on that.
And humility. I mean, Candu's not perfect. I mean, I love it. It's complex. You have 480 or 380, depending on which design you're looking at, fuel channels. You have fueling machines. They're going all the time, right? It's complex. You have stuff that other designs do not have that enable it to function as it functions. To make that work with natural uranium, you have these additional complexities. BWR is the simplest reactor out there, right? You don't even have steam generators. So, in terms of simplicity, you have that BWR that I would say sets the simplicity benchmark. But then you have to have all of these additional safety features, which make it complex.
And why is that, very briefly?
Or in case you had a fuel melt event.
Okay.
Just like with any other reactor design, you had to prevent that. So we had, as I said earlier, we had those from the get-go. But per your point about this language and using advanced, it draws one to infer from that existing designs aren't safe. These focuses on safety. Oh, it has passive safety. Okay, well, that means that what we have currently doesn't have passive safety, and it's risky, and that freaks out the public. Oh, you're running a design that was built in 1970. It's horribly unsafe. No, it's not. So yeah, you're right. That framing really casts in a negative light the existing fleet, which is what's currently doing all of the hard work. But per that point, or to that point rather, if we were to build an EC9 or a series of EC9s,
this would be an enhanced Candu 9, a larger version of the enhanced Candu 6.
Yeah, it would be the Candu 6 EC6 tweaks, right? Applied to the 480 fuel channel design. It wouldn't be any more safe than Darlington. It wouldn't be any more safe than Bruce B. It wouldn't be any more safe than Bruce A. because fundamentally the safety systems are the same. That's not the case with other reactor designs. Their safety systems had to get upgraded for Gen 3 Plus. We added some additional passive parts of it, which were previously active, but they're the exact same safety systems. So that's a differentiator. I don't say that. I wouldn't say that makes the Candu more advanced, per your language there, but it is something to, I think, make note of. We did have, a lot of this comes out of the whole initial incident we had at Chalk River, which was not a Candu, but really underscored the importance of redundant safety systems, which when we did go to pursue actual power reactors was fundamental to how that whole program developed, which I think has been a keystone as to why the whole Candu program has been so safe. You look at India, those are not ideal operating conditions. There's never been an event, right? Like they had some horrible capacity factors doing fuel shortages, and due to being non-compliant with the International Atomic Energy Agency on some of the stuff. Other than poor capacity factors, we don't hear anything out of that, right? So yeah, you have units that may not be deployed in ideal locations that still have not presented a safety risk.
And this is, I mean, I want to be careful here not to denigrate the Indians who, again, faced pretty massive challenges in terms of being cut off from fuel supply, and not to say that they're not very capable at running their reactors, but and similarly,
they are, obviously.
And similarly, I don't want to denigrate people involved in developing reactors with different use cases. I don't want to use the term Gen 4. I don't want to use the term advanced, but clearly, for the long-term sustainability of nuclear, we need fast breeder reactors. Clearly, for decarbonizing process heat, at least kind of that mid-range process heat that we can replace, we need high-temperature gas reactors. This isn't to sort of poke holes and say there's not a use case. Am I biased in terms of the near-term deployment of nuclear, particularly in the West where we're out of practice, that we should be pursuing designs that we're intimately familiar and have operational history with? Absolutely. And I mean, again, just look at the rising capacity factors with all nuclear designs. There are kinks to work out in the early days. And if we move too quickly and don't deploy reactors we're familiar with, the public's not going to have a lot of patience for a reactor that keeps shutting down every 6 weeks or something like that, and having these long delays and threatening the economics. We need to pursue on a core of what we do well, and then we need to start slowly developing other technologies which don't necessarily replace the existing fleet, but add a different use case, just like a diesel engine adds a different use case, or a jet turbine adds a different use case. Anyway, that's kind of my diatribe on that. Why don't we talk a little bit more specific to Ontario now? I'm conscious that we're running up on an hour. We have a proposal, which is in this report, the case for Candu, to build 10 new large Candu reactors in Ontario. Let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of that, maybe where we would put those reactors. In the report, we do talk about Darlington B, which currently is slated for at least one BWRX 300. Let's talk through that a little bit. That site, as I understand it, is probably the most valuable nuclear site in the Western world, in that it is a ready-to-build site with a grandfathered-in environmental impact assessment. We could sort of break ground. Well, there's a few other things to go through, but we could break ground very quickly there. Tell me more about the Darlington B site, and then let's explore some of the other sites available. And again, I mean, I think this is just so exciting because, south of the border, there's a lot of talk about nuclear. There's the Inflation Reduction Act, which is finally steering some dollars towards nuclear, but the whole thing seems to be a bit of a mess. They've invested a lot of time, capital, human resources in the AP1000, and there's no plans to build another one. There's a number of advanced nuclear reactor I just said it. There's a bunch of different use case nuclear reactor concepts. It's a bit clumsy, I'll admit it. A lot of them require HALEU. HALEU is going to be in very short supply because enrichment is intensely limited should sanctions on Russia hold. So anyway, way too long of a question. Let's focus in on the future of Ontario and the future of Candu in Ontario and some of the sites. My God, that was a long question.
As you know, Darlington B was originally supposed to mirror Darlington A. If I had the screenshot, but I don't, so I can't share it. But we have a picture of Darlington, and it looks like Pickering, other than it has 2 vacuum buildings. And Tom had said when he worked for for Ontario Hydro back in the day, and Darlington was being completed, the rebar was still sticking out of the side of Darlington A, where Darlington B was supposed to be constructed. So the plans for the B units, which were supposed to mirror the A units, has been around a very, very long time. Then that plan was resurrected by Dalton McGuinty. This was before the GEA kind of derailed things in Ontario, and AECL wanted to build their the ACR 1000, which is a kind of a light water Candu, takes enriched fuel, and that didn't go anywhere. It made it through the vendor design review process, but then the government basically said that if there were any cost overruns or anything that happened to this project, AECL was on the hook for everything. They had to bear the entire risk of the project. So they're like, okay, well, we're going to price it at $24 billion. And they did. And then we didn't build it because that was stupid. And we should have just built EC6s at the time. But anyways, that was when we went through this environmental assessment process, which took 6 years to get a valid EA, which would take even longer now, as you know, because of the revisions made under the Trudeau Liberals. And that site was licensed for up to 4,800 megawatts. Now, where does the 4,800 megawatts come from? Well, 4 ACR 1000s. They were 1,200 megawatt design, 4,800 megawatts. So that's where that figure came from. And it was supposed to be, as I said, 24 billion for 2. Once ACL was designed or was told that they had to bear the entire project cost. Now, it's important to realize this is on the heels of the successful Kinshan project, which only cost 3.8 billion. So it's not like there wasn't a track record of success here. Like ACL went in there with this in their back pocket. Like, look, we just did this. And McGinty's like, or maybe it was Win at the time. I can't remember. It was, I think later on. So it was Win. It was like, well, guess what? You have to bear the entire risk for the entire project. And they're like, okay, well, if everything goes wrong, we're going to use this number. And that basically killed it. But OPG, assuming that they would eventually get a government that was more receptive to new nuclear, kept the site license active. And they found that, of course, with the Ford government, who's also directed OPG to revisit the Pickering B refurbishment, of course. But at that time, like after Kathleen Wynne formally canceled Darlington B, and OPG has maintained that site license, we, of course, had the federal SMR roadmap. And so we had all these SMR designs that got submitted to the CNSC, and they had this vendor design review process. And some of these designs are like stuff that, might have been theoretically proven in the 50s, 60s, but there's never been a commercial version. Other designs are more conventional, like the BWR X300, which is just a shrunk BWR. And OPG saw an opportunity to, they had this licensed site. They had this federal support to build SMRs. Early on, there was a Candu SMR. SNC Lavalin kind of half-assed resurrected the Candu 3, which was a theoretical design that came out around the same time as the Candu 9, but we never exported it, like the Candu 9. And so that dropped off the radar. So, there was all these hypothetical designs that, could maybe be constructed. We don't know what the risks are, don't really know what the costs are going to be. And then there's this conventional BWR design, which could probably put a price tag on. And so OPG settled on building that instead, building that instead of all these, one of the theoretical designs, because they figured it had the highest likelihood of success. And, somebody had to build an SMR because we had this program. It might as well be OPG. They figured they're going to build something. They build what was currently being supported. Candus were never in the picture after SNC pulled the plug on the Candu SMR. There was never a consideration that we would build Candus at Darlington B beyond that point. It was, okay, we're building SMRs.
Just interject quickly here. The kind of SMR hype train is very interesting to me, because I think prior to about 10 years ago, if you told people that, even in the nuclear industry, that the future of nuclear is to reject economy of scale and to go small, I think you might have got laughed at by a large majority of folks in the nuclear
You'd be
industry.
called an idiot.
And I feel like that's completely flipped. And obviously there's been scaling issues. There's a limit to how large you can go. And I think the EPR is at the edge of that. And there's a bunch of, very specialized equipment. Just like we're seeing with offshore wind. We had a great episode with Angelica Wong. You can take things too large, you run into some additional engineering problems. You're too big for your britches in terms of the grid you're on. But there's been this kind of sweet spot between probably around 600-700 to a gigawatt that nuclear has tended to trend towards. Now, like my take on the SMR rationale is ultimately like why have we sort of changed our minds so much on that? Well, in terms of the hype, shall we say, insufficient demand projections to justify large nuclear. If you don't have customers for the kilowatt hours, you can't throw 4, 5, 6 billion at a large reactor. This idea that nuclear is deeply unpopular because Fukushima happened. It needs a rebrand. We won't even put nuclear in the name. It's a small modular reactor. Similarly, after Fukushima, and maybe without strong impetus for demand growth or fuel security or energy security implications not really being there, this idea that government will never finance nuclear again. So we've got to make it about $1 billion so we can, get private capital in on the game.
Yeah, that you just touched on it.
Right.
It's all about making the capex low enough that private money will flow into it. It's not about having the lowest price per megawatt hour or per kilowatt hour. It's about bringing the capital cost down enough that the private, risk-adverse private parties are willing to put money into it.
So a few more. Let me finish my diatribe, Adlam. So the kind of fourth principle, I guess, is that economies of multiples will trump economies of scales. And I find this interesting because, building 8 units at one site, one certainly gets towards economies of multiples. And if the demand is there, sure, if you only have, a couple gigawatts of demand to fill in, then maybe it is best to build, 6 or 7 SMRs to get economies of multiples at it. But if you have large demand, then you could build a lot of larger nukes and get both economies of multiples and economies of scale. Lastly, and I think this is something that drives me nuts, as we were saying, there's problems with using the wrong words or being not specific. Renewables being an example, advanced nuclear being an example, small modular reactors being an example. Small ranges from micro reactors of maybe a megawatt up to what Rolls-Royce is proposing. Apparently, they fit in the small basket of something towards 500 megawatts.
And it's 500.
Well, they're small modular reactors, so we can move to a manufacturing model. We can just bang them out like Teslas in a factory. Well, maybe with a micro reactor, but let me tell you, 300 to 500 megawatt reactor, you're going to be doing a lot of stick building on site. We had a great episode with Tony Rollstone on the kind of case for SMR economics. And of course, the more that you can modularize, as long as you have very capable manufacturing facilities that can actually size things correctly so the Lego blocks fit together, that's a great idea. But in terms of the kind of stick building elements, things I've heard are, well, we can use steel bricks, which is like as a novel construction technique in terms of laying concrete that might speed it up. No reason why that only applies to small and not large, as far as I can tell with my deep civil engineering training that I have. Okay, I'm being facetious here. And again, I put these ideas forward. I hope that they can be chopped down. But this is a little diatribe similar to advanced nuclear on SMRs. Obviously, Canada has a number of small grids that are a great fit for a small modular reactor. Don't get me wrong. This is not a kind of simplistic diatribe against the idea of having smaller sized reactors, or even reactors that can like the Dow Chemical reactors with X Energy. Producing high temperature process heat. You don't need a gigawatt scale reactor there, right? But in terms of the rationale for small nuclear in Ontario and that Darlington site, as I understand it, current plans have been that we'd build 4 BWX 300s there using 1/4 of the license capacity of the most valuable nuclear site in North America in the midst of massively increased demand projections. And I'm going to keep on the diatribe here, Adlam, if you'll bear me out. The last point being that the utilities are saying, in regards to the enhanced Candu 6, which is through the vendor design review, which is basically ready to build, which we have the Qinshan units demonstrating, They're not interested in a smaller reactor that's 700 megawatts. It's too small. They want to get a gigawatt reactor. They have, we have a number of sites like Wesleyville and Nanticoke, either old coal facilities or places that were wired with transmission for actually oil generation at Wesleyville. But we have these sites. They're precious, precious sites. We can't afford to waste a single licensed megawatt. So we need gigawatt scale Candus. They need to be, we need to develop a new Candu essentially. But this Darlington site is somehow an exception to that rule, that somehow, we shouldn't be taking advantage of the capacity we have when we're forecasting, 50 terawatt hours of increased demand, of organic demand, not climate-based demand, but organic demand in the next 10 years. Diatribe over. That wasn't a question. I feel like one of those people at an event where they're supposed to ask a question, but you just go on a huge lecture and the moderator's like, okay, and trying to give you signals. Anyway, Adlam, you can run with anything I said there.
I don't even know where to begin now. You touched on small grids. So there's the case for SMRs, right? It's better to have a design that maybe has crappier economics, but at least you can build it and put it there than to not have a design that fits. I mean, you look at LaPro, that's a 660 megawatt plant in a grid that really doesn't work with a 660 megawatt plant. So there's a lot of support in play to make LaPro work. Nova Scotia would be even worse. If you tried to squeeze a C6 into Nova Scotia, it's like it represents half of Nova Scotia's power. One unit. You take the unit down, well, there goes Nova Scotia. So those sorts of designs or those sorts of grids are more conducive for an SMR, acknowledging the fact that it's not going to produce power as cheaply as Darlington, right? There's a reason Ontario Hydro went with 4-packs. There's a reason we went from the 380 fuel channel design to the 480 fuel channel design. There's the reason Darlington produces the least expensive electricity. Economies of scale are real, and they work. So our 480 fuel channel plants are cheaper to run than our 380 fuel channel plant. Pickering's more expensive to operate than Darlington and Bruce. They produce more kilowatt hours. So they're going to be cheaper per kilowatt hour because the CAPEX doesn't matter at this point because they're all paid off. The OPEX is higher. You have the same staffing level at Pickering as you have at Bruce or Darlington, but you're producing less electricity. Doesn't mean Pickering's not worth refurbishing. It doesn't mean Pickering's not worth investing in, but it makes the point that economies of scale work. And if you have this 4-pack design, which of course we do, which I would like to see resurrected, but I don't know what the likelihood of that is. That was a learned approach that Ontario Hydro had long prior to its involvement with nuclear. That was the approach that they fleshed out to be the most effective with their thermal plants, period. And it's based on they did the same thing with the hydro plants. How many turbines are at Niagara Falls, right? So how many units were at Nanticoke? 8. How many units were at Lambton? 4. How many units were supposed to be at Wesleyville? 4. So, this multi-unit, they built them in pairs, but they ultimately ended up being, because if I don't say that we're built in pairs, Tom's going to kill me. The nukes were the same way. The pairs that became 4-packs, which became 8-packs. And that was the most efficient. It was deemed the most efficient process by Ontario Hydro, and that's why they pursued it. LaPro doesn't have the economics that the Ontario fleet has because it's 1 unit. And Gentilly was supposed to be 4. There was 1 unit. So, there is that advantage of the economies of scale. And if you do have a grid that's large enough, like Ontario's, where you can continue to build those large units, you'd be absolutely stupid not to. Darlington B should have 4, whatever the modern version of the Candu 9 ends up being. So the EC9 or EC10, it would be incredibly simple. And don't mean simple as in, hey, it takes 5 minutes, but it would be simple to take the existing Candu 9 design, which is what Darlington is, just like the Candu 6, add the EC features, right? The more modularization, the condensing of some of the systems. Basically, just take all of the design tweaks that we did for the EC6, apply them to the Candu 9, which fundamentally is the same design, just blown up, and build that again. It would be extremely similar to the Darlington A plants. And if you could do a 4-pack, if you could do that common turbine haul and optimize the civil side of the plant, which is what Ontario Hydro is doing, that would be your lowest cost option for sure. And you know, to your point about the refurbishments, I mean, we're already building most of these components because they're being replaced as part of the refurbishment. So to build that design when you've already got the supply chain for it, for everything but the civil side, you'd be stupid not to. So yeah, there's definitely a case to build Candu 9s alongside the SMRs. OPG wants to build the SMRs because A, they're supported by the federal government, and they're supported by the federal government across Canada. And B, they want to be the export partner. They figure that if they show that they can do it, then they can then do that in the other provinces because they have some export ambitions now, which is something that Ontario Hydro had. So, you know, they come by it naturally.
So I got one question for you, Adlam, and I guess this all depends upon, you know, we've used the kind of visualization of passing the baton in the relay race between refurbishment to new build. And if that's done smoothly and we take the supply chain that's fully ramped up and that ultra skilled workforce that's learned all kinds of new lessons, both from the operation of these plants for 40 plus years, as well as the refurbishment, that is going to, again, be the most efficient. You know, I can't say it enough. Nuclear is really hard to get right. It's a very low risk construction project to attach solar panels made in China to steel frames, maybe also made in China, maybe here. You get my point. Nuclear construction requires such incredible institutional excellence, right from, you know, the blueprints to the project managers to the engineers to the skilled trades to the person physically working with the object and figuring out what orientation to hold it to do some welding. I mean, it's an incredible level of complexity which needs to be dialed in. And I think, again, that's like, why do I care, you know, what kind of nuclear gets built? Nuclear is good, right? I mean, that's why. I think it's because of kind of a careful analysis and seeing that this, in my mind, and my opinion, probably your opinion as well, this is the most efficient route for Ontario to succeed with a nuclear renaissance, build the credibility, you know, and continue to be an active part of a nuclear renaissance, maybe, you know, new Candu export ambitions available.
We have 50 years of operating experience.
Right. But the question I have for you, the question I have for you, I guess, is related to that timing. You know, moving next to Pickering, the workforce that's available. Should we be jumping ahead at Darlington? And it's rather presumptuous for me to say, so I'm, you know, no planning position here. But you know, if we were making decisions, would you advocate trying to get some enhanced Candu 6s built at that site, given that there may be several years delay in engineering to get the enhanced Candu 9 together? And potentially a change in government, a lack of political will. Like, how important to you do you think it is to get shovels in the ground building new Candu units, even if they are slightly smaller and don't use the full license capacity at Darlington?
I'm going to throw out a curveball here and say I would cancel the SMR at Darlington B. And I'd build that somewhere in the prairies where they can actually utilize it. Use that as the beta testing site and build Candus at Darlington B, which is supposed to be there. OPG could still be the partner and the constructor, but it wouldn't be in Ontario because it's silly building a 260 megawatt unit in Ontario when we already figured the Pickering units were too small, which is why we went with the big 900 megawatt units. But yeah, this is a good debate whether you build the EC6, which is already licensed and good to go, or whether you wait for SNC to resurrect the Candu 9 design and make it the EC9. I think a strategic partnership between SNC and OPG, similar to how Ontario Hydro had the same strategic partnership with AECL, that would enable them to flesh that out somewhat organically. You know, if we could start site prep now and it doesn't matter which design we ultimately go with, they could get, you know, work started on that because they're going to require the same sort of cooling setups no matter which design they build, right? And a lot of the civil work would be the same. They could flesh out whether the EC9 would make it through CNSC approval in time to be constructed within the timeline we're looking at, or whether they just forge ahead with doing the EC6. And you're right, it would you'd be using about half the site license if you built four EC6s, which is still an improvement over building 4 of the BWRs. Yeah. But yeah, it's not ideal. I mean, Darlington, tell me an idealist, but Darlington A and B should mirror each other. They should be the same design, just like Bruce C should be the same as Bruce B. Well, similar to Bruce B. Bruce C should look like when that gets built. Oh, well, I turned down my volume there. Whee! Like Bruce C and D both show up on the Bruce site plan. There are obviously some serious ambitions for that site, and those would have been Candu 9s because that's what was on the table at the time, right? So I'd like to see that design succeed. I think that would be the best choice for Darlington B. But being realistic, yeah, if you had to put shovels in the ground tomorrow sort of thing, you'd have to go with the EC6. Just because it's good to go. It's turnkey. We've already built 2.
All right, Chris, we've gone substantially over the usual 1 hour limit. This might be the longest episode ever, and we are getting into some weeds here. But I really do sincerely hope that the listenership outside of Ontario enjoys this as much as I have. And if you do enjoy Decouple, please consider making a generous donation on Patreon. I was meaning to work that into the middle of the episode. But Chris, an absolute pleasure getting to spend an hour and a half with you and deep dive this. Again, one of the visionary co-founders of C4NE, tremendous asset. You have been mistaken, I think, at multiple occasions for being a nuclear engineer or a project manager. And I think you talk like one.
At Pickering.
Anyway, we'll let it go there, Chris. A pleasure having you back.
Okay, thank you, Chris.